My name is Daniel Trilling. I'm the editor of New Humanist magazine, and I'm also a journalist who writes about refugees and migration and borders and related issues, but I'm not actually going to be talking about my work this evening, thankfully. Instead, I'm here to chair a discussion between these three others on the panel about citizenship-stripping from Blair to May. Now, obviously, at the moment, in the context of the election and the Manchester terrorism attacks, counter-terror policy, ways in which to keep British citizens secure and safe, who is a citizen, who isn't, how does somebody become one, can their citizenship be revoked? These are all questions that are very much at the forefront of current political debate. In Theresa May, we have a Prime Minister who has, in recent years, made it her business to redraw the boundaries of citizenship in one way or another, both on a symbolic level. So people remember last September, in one of her first major speeches, the Prime Minister, she declared, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere, and tried to set out a much more rigidly defined definition of Britishness than perhaps we've been used to in the last decade or two. But behind that, as Home Secretary, she's also been one of the people in charge of Britain's counter-terror policy for some years now, and inherited a system that already was moving towards making it easier for Britain to strip certain people of citizenship or other rights under the guise of counter-terrorism policy. Now, as editor of New Humanist magazine, I was delighted earlier this year to be able to publish an essay by Ismail, in my left hand, which was a long account of both his upbringing in Britain as somebody who arrived as a refugee when a child, who did not have citizenship when he arrived and worked hard to get it, but also about how he felt growing up in an environment where, at least in his accounts, the British citizenship that he had worked hard to obtain was slowly being undermined for people in his situation. And Ismail is a freelance journalist who writes for various different publications other than New Humanist, mostly Prospect magazine, and The Atlantic, and he's written for The Guardian as well. And what we're going to do this evening is invite Ismail to present some of the arguments from his piece, and then we've invited two other eminently qualified people to the panel to give their responses to it. So on my right is Alice Ross, who's a reporter for The Guardian, and previously worked at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and she was one of, with a colleague, she first revealed the British government's use of citizenship stripping as a counter-terrorism tool and has reported on the subject extensively. And then on my far left here is Dr. Ashwini Basantakumar, who is a lecturer in politics, philosophy and law at King's College London. And in her work she specialises on the subject of exile. So thanks everybody for joining us again. I'd like to invite Ismail to speak first.
Thank you. So thanks so much to Waz for having us here. Thank you so much, Daniel, Ashwani, Alice, for agreeing to be here in Cambridge. So as Daniel was explaining, I wrote a long read, or an essay, I guess, for the New Humanist, which was later republished in The Guardian, which explores the issue of people having their citizenship taken away, both from the perspective of my own experiences and my own journey as somebody who came to the United Kingdom as a 10-year-old from Somalia, and also looking at some of the wider context in which these kind of conversations that we've been having around who gets the right to be British and who doesn't, as Daniel was sort of just etching out, have become more prominent in light of everything that's been happening in the last couple of weeks in Britain. So I'm just going to go through some of the arguments of that essay, and then the other two speakers will comment and have a conversation. So the British government has the power to revoke citizenship of dual UK nationals or naturalised Britons with little oversight and virtually no public scrutiny. To do so, the Home Secretary needs neither the approval of a court nor that an individual be convicted of a crime. And the cases in which these have happened have largely involved so-called terrorism cases. This practice has grown since 9/11, when legislation was passed to make this process easier, and under Labour, just 5 people had their citizenship taken away. But under Theresa May, which was the Home Office, about 70 people had their citizenship taken away, and Alice will be going into some more detail about some of those cases. The UK government can strip people of their rights, and it's a fact that is rarely discussed in public, and it's something that has barely been scrutinised both in the media but also in Parliament. And usually, since 9/11, this measure of getting rid of people's citizenship in cases of terrorism, where somebody is either a naturalised citizen like I am, or a dual national, is usually being presented or framed by the government. First Tony Blair, then later Theresa May as Home Secretary, and now as Prime Minister. This has been presented usually as a shortcut to fighting terrorism, but the reality is that this masks the true purpose of such laws, which is to embolden the state at the expense of ordinary people. The roots of this go beyond and further than 9/11. I argue in the piece, and I mentioned this in the essay, that we really have to look at the Oldham riots in 2001. In May 2001, there were these riots in northwest England between white and Asian communities. There were violent, short riots, and the worst racial riots in Britain for a generation. And those riots began a very fraught public conversation in Britain, in the media, between so-called good, moderate Muslims and bad radical Muslims, and between the good and the bad immigrant. And we had conversations in Britain such as talk of parallel lives, no-go areas, and the focus of those riots was effectively kind of sped up by the events of September the 11th in the United States and George W. Bush's declaration of war on terror added to this intense conversation. And now we see the events that have happened in the last week, tragically, in Manchester. And we've also seen other more recent attacks, such as the one on Westminster Bridge. And the people in these cases usually have been people who either became naturalised British citizens or were born to one or more parent who came to the United Kingdom as a migrant and who gained citizenship. And what's interesting is that in these recent cases in Manchester and Westminster, both of these suspects were referred to by a Prime Minister, but also the media, as British born. So again, we're seeing a kind of shift happening between people who have being British simply because of the whole citizenship and saying they're British born, which is in effect to denote they're kind of foreigners, but also to denote the fact that they don't have quite as much right to have citizenship. And what's happened since 9/11, I argue in the piece that I did for the New Humanist, is that these conversations have shaped and informed our counter-terrorism policy. And it's 16 years since 9/11, it's about 12 years since 2005 terrorist attacks. Yet today, we've had 850 young British people who've gone over to Syria and Iraq to fight for ISIS. And we've had over 400 young British people who've returned from ISIS-controlled areas in Iraq and Syria. And allegedly, over 15,000 people have been investigated by the security counter-terrorism forces in the United Kingdom. So you see the threat following 9/11 and the measures that are brought in to deal with that, such as deportations, such as being held in detention, and usage of citizenship-stripping, which I'll come into a little bit. There's a long history predating 9/11. All of those kind of measures, which were a response to 9/11 and informed by the Oldham riots and those conversations we've had, have in fact got worse. And today, Britain actually faces the worst terrorist threat. But the origins of these laws go back much further, to 1914 and the First World War. The 1914 British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act was put in place to revoke the citizenship of naturalised British persons, and that was done largely in response to the First World War and fears about the loyalty of dual German British nationals. A further law passed in 1918 created new and wide ranging grounds to revoke citizenship. So in theory, and that was added on to the law in 1918. So effectively, since 1918, the Home Secretary in the United Kingdom has had the power to remove a naturalised person or do nationality holders British citizenship if it was considered conducive to the public good to do so. But a law from 1981 prevented them from doing so if it made the person stateless. And what's changed since 9/11 is that that restraint has gradually been abandoned. In 2006, the Home Secretary was given further powers to revoke British citizenship. At the time, the Blair government sought to allay concerns about the misuse of such powers. Quote, the Secretary of State cannot make an order on a whim. The Home Office Minister Angela Eagle said at the time about the law, when the law was first proposed, and she added, and he will be subject to judicial oversight when he makes an order. So those laws from after 9/11 were presented as a merely temporary measure to deal with the extraordinary security threat that had been posed by 9/11 and by the fact that there have been real concerns of radicalisation amongst Muslim communities in Britain. So there have been a number of cases, I won't go into too many of them, but I'll just mention one. One of the cases in where somebody has had this issue taken away involves a young man called Einashe. He was somebody I knew growing up in Camden, North London. Like me, he was a British-born subject who had come to the United Kingdom and had later got naturalised. And whilst he was in Camden in about 2008-9, he was complaining that he was being harassed by the security services. So he said, and some of his other friends in the local community in the Camden area had said, people who were posed as security officials from MI5, I believe, had sort of tried to recruit them as informants. And to escape this kind of intrusion and harassment, he had left for Somalia. Subsequently, he disappeared, turning up in Djibouti, which is a tiny country on the Red Sea, which neighbours Somalia. And there he ended up in the hands of the Americans. And whilst all that was happening, at some point he had his British citizenship taken away from him. So when his family, in 2012, called the British authorities and said, our son is missing, we need help, they were told effectively that the son was no longer a British citizen, and therefore the British government could not do anything about it. Now, we don't know all the details, but at some point, Einashe was taken, presumably rendered by the Americans into the program in Djibouti. And by the way, in Djibouti, Americans have their only permanent military base in Africa. And that base has been home, for example, to drone program going into Somalia and Yemen. Eventually, Einashe turned up in New York, in what's been sort of referred to as the Guantanamo of New York. It's a prison in New York where he's been held. And he's been held there for some time, and this year, beginning this year, he was sentenced to prison for allegedly abating and helping Al-Shabaab, which is a terror group working in Somalia. Now, we don't know how he confessed, we don't know whether he was under duress. There's a lot of questions, but these are one of the classic cases that has shown the evidence of what's been happening since 9/11, where the British state has been emboldened to use this instrument of citizenship stripping, which had been on the statute books in effect since 1914, but was rarely used since 9/11, has been used quite significantly. So, although these measures were presented as temporary, they have in fact become permanent. And in the last 15 years, the kind of permanency of these laws has been accompanied by a rise in suspicion and fears around people of Muslim background, people who are foreign-born, people who are naturalised citizens, and in the public conversation from our politicians, in the media, in the books, in our institutions, we've had ongoing conversations around issues around shared values, and citizenship and participation. That conversation has sadly, unfortunately, been accompanied by a deepening sense of suspicion, as I said, but also by real rise in things like Islamophobia, and that has been fairly problematic for people in the Muslim community. And what these laws have in effect done is that they have normalised citizenship stripping, and it's in fact I argue in the piece, and I'm sure I will talk about this in more detail, but in fact, this has now become a key aspect of counter-terrorism. It's part of the toolbox, if you like. Those measures that were used after 9/11 were presented initially as temporary. They were there merely to deal with an extraordinary situation which 9/11 attacks had led to, but in fact, these things have become permanent. And as I quoted Angela Eagle, the Home Office Minister at the time, 2006, saying that these laws, there'd be some kind of control, some kind of oversight. The reality is that in the last 15 years, there's been little oversight, no public conversation or scrutiny of these laws, and they have in fact increasingly become permanent. And people have largely accepted, and when I say people, I'm referring largely to politicians here, have accepted these new powers because they are presented as a way to keep the country safe from terrorism. What's happening now is that citizenship-stripping is now a fixture of the state, and it's defended in the usual manner, which is to say, if you're somebody who's of a Muslim background, who's a naturalised citizen like I am, or you're a dual nationality holder, you have nothing to fear if you've done nothing wrong. That's the kind of usual frame which is used. And that's interestingly the kind of attacks I've had from people on the other side of the political spectrum who've accused me, who've sort of attacked my essay, have usually said this point and said, well, me, is not the person who's target here. But the problem is that, that is a red herring, because the usual caveat is that this concerns terrorists and criminals, which is a complete red herring. And as I said at the beginning, the true purpose of such laws is ultimately to empower the state at the expense of ordinary people. And these near-arbitrary changes have not only brought very little public attention to what's going on, but they're also creating a two-tier system of citizenship between people like myself, who are naturalised citizens or dual nationals, and those who are born in Britain to British parents. And in effect, that's what these laws have created, and the usage and application of these laws over the last 15 years since 9/11 has in effect created a situation where there's two tiers system of citizenship, and it's making a lot of people, including myself, feel like second-class citizens, because our citizenship is in effect permanently up for review. Hannah Arendt memorably described citizenship as the right to have rights. But for people of migrant backgrounds, such as myself, this has been eroded. And by the way, we're not a small group. We're not talking about tens of thousands of people. According to the 2011 census, there are 3.4 million naturalised Brits. And I just want to end on saying that there's also not just the kind of usage of these laws and the fact that it's a red herring to suggest that they don't have an application beyond designation of their application for so-called terrorism cases. What has also happened is that these laws have been accompanied by both a deepening suspicion and fears around Muslims, but also have given political cover to, for example, President Donald Trump and his Muslim ban. That did not happen in a vacuum. There's a thread which connects the policies of Western governments and their counter-terror policies and what's happening now, and these increasingly more extreme steps. I, for example, was doing a fellowship at Columbia University, and I was in the United States when the Trump travel ban, or Muslim ban, as I call it, came into effect in January, and I was actually unable to leave the United States because even though I hold a British passport, I was born in Somalia, and I had to seek assurances from the British government, who assured me that I would not be stopped and searched, and so on. The reality is I'd already been stopped and searched. Many Muslims who've been travelling, or those who are labelled as Muslims who've been travelling to the United States for many years, had been stopped and searched, for example. But there's a connection between the policies pursued by the Blair government and that have been added and increasingly instrumentalised, and have become a key component of the of the counter-terrorism operations under May. So in the end, the really key thing you've got to think about, and the key thing I'd like to maybe have a conversation with you about is, in the end, what we should be focused on is not on the few cases where people have been, so-called terrorism cases, but where the state ought to have such enormous power. Does the state, have the right to have such enormous power to get rid of people's citizenship with no oversight? As I said, people can have their citizenship stripped with having no evidence presented against, the Home Secretary who issues the order does not need to seek a court order. So that is the key issue to think about. And until that is resolved, people like me who are naturalised British citizens or those who have dual nationality will be made not just to feel like second-class citizens, but our own citizenship will be permanently up for review. Thank you.
Thanks, Ismail. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the cases that we've looked at where citizenship has been used and give you a sense, really, of how the powers of deprivation of citizenship have been exercised by the state. I first came across the concept that you could lose your citizenship when I was working at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. I was working on a project where we were tracking a number of drone strikes. And in the course of this, we came across a drone strike in Somalia that killed a young man named Bilal al-Bajawi. Now, he was British. In the course of some of the reporting that we read around this, they mentioned that he had been British until his citizenship had been taken away, about 18 months before he died. And this was curious, this wasn't something that we were familiar with. So we started to explore how it is that you can lose your citizenship. You don't think of it as something which can be taken away. You think of it as a sort of permanent, immutable state. We lodged freedom of information requests with the government. We held conversations with lawyers and advocacy groups. And we discovered in the process of this that a friend of Bilal al-Bajawi's, named Mohammed Saka, a childhood friend of his, and a friend of Einashe's as well, who was killed in a drone strike a month later, had also lost his citizenship. And this is the point at which you have to start wondering, what does this process actually mean? What does your citizenship mean? Does it give you protections? In the UK, we don't have a constitution. We don't have a clear sense of our citizenship. We don't pledge allegiance to the flag. But clearly there was some kind of process at work here. We also found out that Einashe had lost his citizenship 6 months before he disappeared and later turned up in detention in Djibouti, where his parents were told that they couldn't provide consular assistance. He was then transported to New York, where he's now in a supermax jail. In total, we identified around 15 cases, and each of them were fascinating. And from those cases, you can start to see patterns emerge, which indicate how they're actually using this power. All but one of the cases that we identified were related to Muslim people. It is primarily used as a counter-terrorism power. Now, this is interesting because there are all sorts of reasons that someone might be deemed not conducive to the public good. You think about, senior criminals, gangsters, fraudsters, war criminals. There are all sorts of people here in Britain and who hold British citizenship abroad, but it's being used very specifically as a counter-terrorism power. All but one of the cases that we uncovered were male. They were all men. The exception to this, and she's also the exception to the all Muslims rule, is Anna Chapman, who is a Russian spy. In 2010, they busted a major Russian spy ring in America, and one of those individuals had British citizenship from an earlier marriage. So she was the only one who lost her citizenship. The only woman and the only non-Muslim. In all but one of the cases, the individuals were abroad at the time their citizenship was taken away, which, again, is interesting. In many cases, in one case, an individual has managed to return since he lost his citizenship. He appears to have used a false passport, and it's proving enormously difficult for the government to get rid of him again. But this means that the individuals, where they are fighting legal appeals, because, as Ismail said, this is not a power that gets judicial approval in advance, you have to fight your case retroactively. It means people are forced to fight their appeals from overseas. The appeal process itself is also very, very interesting. Where cases are, and it indicates another reason that you might want to use this power rather than conventional criminal or other counter-terrorism powers. Where cases rely on evidence gathered by intelligence, you fight your appeal through a tribunal called the the Special Immigrations Appeal Commission. This is a specially formulated court which can hear intelligence-related material in closed sessions where the defendant is not, or the claimant, because it's a civil case obviously, the claimant is not allowed to be present, and neither are their lawyers. Instead, you have a special arbitrator. So it's a total departure from what we understand the principles of open justice. This means that, in effect, you can lose your citizenship and not know the reason, not know the evidence, and not be able to brief your lawyer effectively to be able to argue your case. You know, if, for example, the state is asserting that the surveillance indicates such and such a thing, you can't come back with a counter-explanation that says, no, I was doing X or Y or Z. So your lawyers are effectively fighting with one hand behind their backs, and you're also trying to fight your appeal from overseas. We've come across 2 cases where the appeals were successful. One was in 2003. It was the first time this power was used since it was revived. That was Abu Hamza. You'll note that he's in jail in the United States anyway. They deported him anyway. The second one was an individual called Hilal al-Jeddah. He first lost his citizenship in, I think, 2005. He fought his case all the way to the Supreme Court, where they ruled that actually the loss of his citizenship would leave him stateless, and that would be illegal. They rewrote the laws, and a couple of weeks after he lost his citizenship, after he won his Supreme Court case, they issued new papers and stripped his citizenship again. Now, it's interesting as well that even in the second process, so when they rewrote the laws in 2014, under the Immigration Act, they argued that they had to do it because individuals like Hilal al-Jeddah were posing such a risk. But they used the old laws when they stripped his citizenship the second time. So you end up in this sort of Kafkaesque scenario where you are powerless, effectively, against the state. Now, I also thought that Ismail was quite right to highlight this use of British-born, that you're not British if you're from an immigrant community, you're British-born. Being British-born isn't enough to protect you from losing your citizenship. Mohammed Saka, the second individual who was killed in a drone strike, his parents were Egyptian, but he was born in the UK. He never took any action to assert his Egyptian citizenship. He didn't hold an Egyptian passport. He had never taken any steps to claim himself as an Egyptian. But because he was theoretically eligible for Egyptian citizenship through his parentage, they argued that actually removing his citizenship wouldn't make him stateless, and so therefore they could take away his citizenship. There was another case we came across where 4 members of the same family, all of whom were born in Britain, lost their citizenship after they travelled to Pakistan. So the father, who was born in Britain, lost his citizenship, and his 3 sons, who were also born in Britain, who were second generation British, lost their citizenship. At a certain point you have to question, these may be bad guys, but there are bad guys, So that brings me to the question of what is the function of losing your citizenship? Why would you go through this? Why would the government choose to use this process? What cause does it serve if you're trying to fight terrorism? Someone who poses a threat still poses a threat. Was there some kind of process there by which, their British citizenship gave them a protection, which was then taken away? But if you look at cases like Mohammed Emwazi and other people who've been killed in Syria, many of whom have been killed, openly by the British government or, working hand in hand with the American government, and they've openly acknowledged this, they did not lose their citizenship. So it's not clear to me that British citizenship bestows any special protections. There's a contrast there with American citizenship. When the Americans wanted to kill one of their own citizens on purpose, Anwar al-Awlaki, they went through enormous amounts of legal processes because American citizenship is a very different and much more specific concept than British citizenship. There's the question of whether taking away someone's citizenship is basically easier than fighting a criminal case. Because it's a civil process, because your immigration status, your citizenship status, is a civil process, the government has to argue against you on the balance of probabilities. It's a much easier test for them to pass than having to prove something beyond reasonable doubt, which is the criminal burden of proof. And of course, once you're out of the country, it's harder to argue. For me, I think the most persuasive the most persuasive reason that I've come up with, or the most persuasive use case that I've come up with. And it's possible that different governments have used it for different reasons, but the most persuasive thing for me is a notion of changing the locks. So they wait until you're out of the country, and in some cases we've come across they've actually waited and done it days after someone's left the country, had all the paperwork ready, and just signed it when someone's gone. So this notion of changing the locks, trying to make sure that bad guys can't get back into the country. They're sort of held at bay. Their passports are cancelled. They're somebody else's problem. But we don't know what the government thinks about this because they've largely refused to discuss it. And so we asked them time and time again when we were researching it. We wanted to hear the government's perspective. We wanted to hear what they're doing here. Hannah Arendt obviously said that citizenship is the right to have rights. The British government does not agree. Theresa May's statement, which is used in the House of Parliament, which they gave to us every single time we ever asked, is citizenship is a privilege, not a right. That's what I've got to, basically.
So I wanted to talk about two different aspects, I think, that really sort of jumped out at me from the two presentations. So the first is thinking about citizenship and the extent to which the power to revoke citizenship and the power that seems to be pretty easily exercised, actually, with very little oversight and very little accountability, how that devalues some of the goods of citizenship. But then also to think about the ways in which the revocation of citizenship is a form of punishment, right? And so also thinking about citizenship and criminal law and the ways in which these are engaged in some sort of unholy alliance in this particular context. So in Western Europe, I'd say from the 1980s onwards, there was a push towards a more liberalized naturalization regime. Okay? And this was primarily, I think, a sort of democratic imperative. You simply couldn't have individuals who were resident for many, many years who didn't really have any feasible way of becoming citizens and becoming full members of the community. So what that means, though, is that there wasn't necessarily a kind of cultural transformation about what it means to be a citizenship of this community, right? So I think, so I'm Canadian, and we're very smug about how multicultural and wonderful we are. But even in North America, which sort of self-understands itself as being, a country of immigrants, right? So the US and Canada sort of pretend to think this. I think recent history shows that there's always lurking in the background other conceptions of what it means to be a true Brit or a true German or a true American, right? So even in the US, which I think is very explicit about the idea that America isn't a sort of ethnic nationality, but it's actually a commitment of citizens, clearly many, many people don't think that, right? So I think there's always lurking around, different conceptions of what does it really mean to be a member of this community, and if we just use like British TV as a guide, right? So there are some people who think that being British is like living in Downton Abbey, and there are some people who think that being British is Coronation Street, right? So there's always these different conceptions. And I think the fact that there are these different ideas makes it really important that we have this kind of formal protection, this formal status, this formal equality, which you might think of as a sort of necessary condition to start having more substantive equality between people who come from different religious backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, some who were born in the country, and some who have migrated recently. So there are two ways in which citizenship is really valuable, right? So one is what I'm going to call a liberal view, right? Which is that citizenship gives you a status, it gives you a certain set of rights, and it protects you as an individual against the state. And the primary function of citizenship is that you get to do, you get to go about your business, you get to do whatever you want to do work-wise, you can have your family life, you can garden, and there are just all of these limits on what the state can do to you, right? So this is, you might think of this as like a really minimum way of thinking about citizenship, right? It's mostly about protecting you against the state. Maybe a sort of a thicker view, right, which we might call the Republican sense, is actually that citizenship is about this lived, expressive equality between citizens, that we're all involved together in this collective project. And what citizenship really does is it expresses our status as equals. It allows us to participate as equals. And it means that we enjoy equality and non-domination in all domains of life. Right? So the kind of, think of this as the eyeball test of citizenship. It means that we can look each other in the eye, right? Because we have the same status and we have the same dignity. So when you have a regime of citizenship revocation, right, it really undermines both of these ways in which citizenship is good for us, right? So it means that actually you don't have this robust status. You can't sort of just faff about gardening, getting on with your life, because you're just never entirely sure that you have this status, right? So if the status is necessary for you to pursue all kinds of life projects, you don't actually enjoy that when it turns out the state can, with some ease, decide to revoke your citizenship. There's very little that you can do by way of accountability. There's little judicial oversight. And, I think disappointingly, not a ton of public outcry, right? So it actually means that in your interactions with the state, for example, you'd be very nervous, right? But it also, I think, in a way, infects the ways in which you interact with a host of other people, right? So if you are in a conflict, for example, or some sort of dispute with somebody who doesn't face the same threat of citizenship revocation, right, you simply aren't going to look them in the eye, right, in the same way. Because lurking in the background is the fact that, you're susceptible or you're vulnerable in a way that they simply aren't, right? And so this really just cuts against, what many of us would just take for granted about what is the value of citizenship, right? And so there's no small irony that I think citizenship revocation always gets justified on the grounds that, well, now we're really sort of reminding people of the value of citizenship, right? So there's a tension here, which is that you want to make something scarce, and that's going to increase its value. But one of the ways in which you do that is to really infect and undermine what makes citizenship so important and valuable. So let me then move on to, I think, the really sort of odd ways in which citizenship revocation acts as a punishment, right? So the individuals who are subject to revocation of citizenship have committed horrible crimes, right? And they're usually punished for those crimes. So there's a question about what is citizenship revocation doing as a second-order punishment, right? So the U.S. Supreme Court, which I think we should always quote with some caution because it's also come down with terrible decisions, but the U.S. Supreme Court thought that revocation of citizenship would be cruel and unusual punishment because you've already punished somebody and now you're withdrawing their status, right? Their very sort of status as an individual in a political community. And that's just always going to be disproportionate. I think it's so it also interacts with the fact that citizenship revocation always, or typically, affects people who have some sort of foreign ties, right? So I think, one, the fact that you have a foreign tie just sort of makes you more suspicious, right? But I also think, in a way, it means that, well, here are these sort of unsavory characters, we'd really rather get rid of them. The problem with British-born citizens who have been here for generations is that there's nowhere else to send them to, right? So you can't send them off to the colonies anymore. So you're kind of stuck with them. But the great thing, right, about criminals with foreign ties is that there is this kind of notional other place that you can send them back to, right? And there is this weird idea that you're sending people back to places. So in many cases, these are individuals who've never set foot in these countries, right? But there is this sort of, so again, I think, lurking in the background is this idea, well, you're not really from here, you're from this other place, and we've done you this sort of enormous favor by letting you come in and be one of us, but you're not really one of us because the minute you do something, we're going to send you back home, right? I think another way in which this sort of interacts with the criminal law is that, so we typically, so citizenship law and criminal law, also uses ways of policing the boundaries, right, between the good sort and the undesirables, right? And I think, so I think the reason, revocation of citizenship has to do with national security and, anti-terrorism measures. But I think, I sort of encourage us to also think about the ways in which the same rhetoric allows you to start criminalizing the poor, right? So there's sort of this, this like ever-shrinking group of like the really good sort, right? So you can cash this out as hardworking families, the sort of, I don't know, like nobody seems to really care about, I don't know, just people who aren't hardworking families. Like, who are they, right? I don't know. But there are some hardworking people, there are good Brits, they're the decent sort, So I keep thinking Downton Abbey, right? Like I think everyone in Downton Abbey, right, including the servants who are just like so happy to be servants, like belong in this like tiny world of like the Trulias. And then there are the poor, there are the homeless, and I think increasingly there's a way in which these individuals get criminalized, right? So now, so I don't want to sort of minimize the idea that revocation of citizenship isn't this special thing. I guess I'm just trying to warn us that the rhetoric and the techniques and the attitudes that allow you to say to somebody who was born here, well, you're not really here, from here, we can, revoke your citizenship so that it's easier for us to kill you, or we'll just send you off somewhere else, might have this kind of mission creep, right? And then it starts targeting many more individuals who are just not sort of the ideal group. And hopefully, right, like that at least would make for greater solidarity, I think, amongst people fighting against revocation of citizenship, if you think that the attitudes that we express towards foreigners eventually ends up being turned inwards, right? So I'm going to leave it at that.
Just wanted to have a brief thought on my own before we open it up to discussion, which is picking up on something Alice said in her presentation, which I think was getting at the way that many people would react to hearing about the citizenship-stripping powers, which is, well, why should the rest of us care about them? They're happening to the bad guys, and perhaps that might be necessary in the context of there being a big threat from terrorism. And I think Ashwini did give us some very useful pointers there about how actually this does point to something bigger than just this one instance. And just while the panelists were speaking, it made me think of a couple of things that have come up in my own research where I think you can see this happening. And where it might be more useful to think of this use of citizenship stripping as just one end of a kind of extreme end of the spectrum of things that the government is doing to undermine the right of people to belong in one way or another. One example is with how the British government has been treating refugees in recent years. So that phrase about locking the doors, they're changing the locks rather. When people have gone, it's much harder for them to come back in. Well, that thing about having to appeal the immigration decision while you're out of the country reminded me immediately of what happens with asylum claims, where Britain in the last 10 years has been increasingly using the policy of deport now, appeal later. And so there you have people who are not the bad guys, but a very similar thing applies to them in that case. Another thing it made me think of was this focus on foreign criminals. So again, well, these people are bad guys, therefore why should you care about what happens to them? And it made me wonder if perhaps another phenomenon that's going on at the moment, which is that people are very often, if a foreign national has committed a crime in Britain, they will be deported at the end of their sentence. But that this has really been extended in the last few years to much more minor crimes and has been applied to people who are British citizens in all but name. So say, a young man who has Jamaican citizenship but who has been here since birth or since the age of 2 or something, where they might not have the papers to say that they're a British citizen, but in practice, in the way that they've gone about their lives and the interactions they've had, they've been taking part in citizenship here. And then the final category of people I think you can see these things are applying to are people in receipt of various kinds of benefits from the state. And the most obvious one, and I've used it as an example in things I've written before, people in receipt of housing benefit in the UK. So it's a recognised human right under the UN Convention that you're not supposed to restrict the internal movement of your citizens as a state. Well, there is actually now an effective restriction on the internal movement of people receiving housing benefit because you're told you have to be in a particular place to receive it. So either the local authority where you live for a long time, or what we're seeing increasingly in London because of the rise in rent prices there. People are being told, well, we'll give you, by a London council, we'll give you housing benefit, but only if you move to Birmingham or Solihull or somewhere else. So I just wanted to throw those examples out there before we open up to the discussion. So first of all, did any of the panelists have any responses to make at this point?
I just go back to the point you're raising, which is at the very end, what you were saying, that, and it's really, really important to say this, and Alex as well, there are bad guys, but that's not, for me at least, another point in the essay of Daniel, the Humanist, was saying that's a red herring, that's often the kind of frame that politicians use. Actually, we've got to look at the much wider kind of cost of these kind of policies, and as Daniel just illustrated, whether it's the case of, for example, housing benefits, or whether it's in the case of deportations, that's an increase. I think that's a really important thing. And then make is, there is a difference between being a citizen on paper and truly belonging. And that's why when they say British born, it's become something that's been used recently. It wasn't used a few years ago. Every recent terrorist attack that has involved somebody in Britain, often the first thing in the headline of the newspaper, the first thing the Prime Minister or politician would say, British born, to denote they're foreigners. And it's more than that. So I think the reality is that though citizenship-stripping for me is obviously a terrible thing, and people, if they're being accused of a crime, ought to face the law or to be taken to court and have evidence presented against them, the usual process. What's even more serious is that after 9/11, Tony Blair, I remember speeches he gave, several of them, but I think there's one immediately after 9/11, 2002 maybe, and he was speaking in the House of Commons and he was sort of saying, we're strong, we have values in this country in Britain. Terrorism won't change us, it won't change habeas corpus, it won't change the fundamental framework that we exist in Britain ought to be a liberal democracy. And I think, let's look at where we are now. It's been 16 years since 9/11. I mean, are we more or less liberal? I would argue, not less liberal. And I think that terrorism is a threat. But I remember a few years ago, just President Obama saying that more people in the US were shot by toddlers than killed by terrorists. That isn't to downplay that terrorism is a threat, but it's to say, are we taking a realistic, rational response to this? And are we thinking clearly when we have these legislative responses to this threat, that the consequence for these communities who often security services need fighting terrorism as informers and as information gatherers, it's falling to those people, and that's really worrying. So I think that point really came clearly from both what you're saying. It's something that's really important, especially those people who sort of attack people who make these arguments. It's very important to make them aware of that, because they'll say they're just apologising for terrorists or would-be terrorists. That's not the case.
I think one of the things that struck me doing the research on this is the extent to which we have evolved parallel legal systems, parallel immigration processes, parallel ways of dealing with these cases, which sit entirely outside of 1,000 years of criminal law. We've developed totally different systems for dealing with terrorism when domestic violence kills 2 women a week. Obviously, last week was appalling. I was looking at, the victims of the Manchester bombing all week. But 2 women die every week from domestic violence, and we don't view it through anything like the same prism. To use that old trope with the terrorists winning effectively.
So yeah, this is just I think maybe a sort of minor academic quibble. But often when I talk about the revocation of citizenship and exile, there's a kind of hypothetical question. Well, surely we think we can imagine like a British person who is actually deserving of losing his or her citizenship, right? So you might think there are these like hypothetical scenarios that we could imagine where it might be that there is somebody like who's hell-bent on like destroying the United Kingdom. Like, would that person be deserving of losing his or her citizenship? So I think, just like 2 quick responses in anticipation of this possible question, right? So one is that like we do there are many political crimes, right? So, and political crimes have sentences. So you might think the criminal justice system has developed in ways that can actually deal with these kinds of political crimes. I think the second, maybe more philosophical point would be, so similar arguments were made about torture, right? So this was especially in the context of after the attacks on the World Trade Center in 2001, which were, well, you know, maybe there are sort of these justifications for torture. And it might be that we can think of this like, you know, hypothetical scenario where it would be justified. But the problem is setting up a system, right, like an entire set of processes which are designed to try to catch this one possible hypothetical system, you know, will actually create enormous injustices, right? So I think even if we think that there might be individuals who do not deserve to be British, right, on whatever conception of deserving you have, the problem is once you have a legal framework that does this, that it actually just ends up creating far more injustices than it might actually remedy.
My question there would be, what would be the purpose of making someone not British? What's the purpose of saying you don't deserve to be British? You know, so effectively I would say that the revocation of citizenship and the way that they've gradually increased their abilities to do so has renegotiated the relationship between the citizen and the state. It's made your citizenship a conditional status. Well, for some people, if you could, where it currently stands is that since 2014, if you could theoretically claim another citizenship, then you are entitled to lose your citizenship, even if that would make you stateless. Now, this means, in effect, that if you are nth generation British, and you know, if your parents are British, then you can't lose your citizenship because you wouldn't be eligible for a citizenship from elsewhere. Except my partner's Australian. Would I theoretically be able to claim citizenship through him were I to lose my British citizenship? So what does this mean, really? And I think it's, you know, once you get into that, it's quite a slippery slope.
Okay, I'd like to open it up for wider discussion at this point. We have until about 7 p.m, as far as I know. So I'll just see if anybody's got questions they'd like to ask. As it's a seminar, we want to encourage conversation. I will accept comments as well as questions on the condition that they're brief. Please do bear that in mind. I think maybe I'll take two questions at a time as well. So,
Hi, my name's Barbara. I'm from Pembroke. And you can hear I'm not from here. So I'm interested in thinking comparatively about some of this. My first question, in terms of, are there any circumstances in which stripping citizenship is legitimate? If you ask, if one of these guys who has parents commits treason, because that's what this is trying to, that's not an appropriate reaction to that person. So whatever the appropriate reaction to that person would be for committing treason must be the appropriate reaction for anyone committing treason. Okay, I don't see how you make different sorts of categories of who would deserve what back to Hanover. If we think about what's going on in the States, thank God, actually, there have been 3 court decisions saying that those bans are not legal. That doesn't make any difference, really, not for who gets to come in, who might be considered to be Muslim, but for Mexicans. So the first thing that happened, and was that you have this ban that is supposed to be keeping the country safe from these Islamic states, and ICE goes straight for immigrants along the border. Right? So that's one question, whether or not this establishes a precedent that might mean that the next guys who lose their citizenship are people that come in from Eastern Europe. No, that it's this kind of contagion thing. Now the other thing that's been happening, and this has to do with Native Americans. So if anybody has a right to a right, it's the guys who are there first. And what's happened there is an increasing criminalization of dissent, so that you are losing your First Amendment rights, which, anyway. So that's my question. It's perhaps a complicated question, but my question in terms of thinking about what's going on here are the ways in which the contagion spreads to cover different kinds of situations. Because always, if people say, well, it's they're bad guys, the question is who gets to define who's the bad guy and what constitutes sedition, what constitutes all this stuff. And we know all this from history.
Thank you.
So it doesn't come into question. Yes.
Let's take one more question from the man there before we pass on.
Thank you. Theresa May, I've been to Ireland last night, did the talk there. Yeah, before Alice referred specifically to people being killed in drone strikes, I was already thinking about military drones during that first presentation, because there's such an obvious parallel of unaccountable government action. Now, I'm not clear whether the person who lost their citizenship and was then killed in a drone strike, whether there's a connection with it, coincidence.
It happens to.
There was a connection. I don't know whether it's the guys from Irish Washington near Lincoln, where they control British drones from. But in effect, it almost looks like you have capital punishment without any trial.
Just to clarify on that point, Saka and Bajami were both killed by US drone strikes, and we don't understand fully what the relation. So they lost their citizenship when they first went to Somalia. And about 18 months later, they were each killed in drone strikes about a month apart. They were drones flown out of Djibouti, where their friend Einashe was later held. And so these were all US covert actions, and we never fully understood the relationship between those things, but it would be extraordinary if they were unconnected. Now, is it simply that the British and the Americans both regarded these as bad dudes, or is it that they were, or is it